The Sun's Veto, a short story by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 1. To the eyes of a man viewing it from behind, the nut-brown hair was a wonder and a mystery. Under the black beaver hat, surmounted by its tuft of black feathers, the long locks, braided and twisted and coiled like the rushes of a basket, composed a rare, if somewhat barbaric example of ingenious art. One could understand such weavings and coilings being wrought to last intact for a year, or even a calendar month, but that they should be all demolished regularly at bedtime after a single day of permanence seemed a reckless waste of successful fabrication. And she had done it all herself, poor thing. She had no maid, and it was almost the only accomplishment she could boast of. Hence the unstinted pains. She was a young invalid lady, not so very much of an invalid, sitting in a wheeled chair, which had been pulled up in the front part of a green enclosure, close to a bandstand where a concert was going on during a warm June afternoon. It had place in one of the minor parks or private gardens that are to be found in the suburbs of London, and was the effort of a local association to raise money for some charity. There are worlds within worlds in the great city, and though nobody outside the immediate district had ever heard of the charity, or the band, or the garden, the enclosure was filled with an interested audience sufficiently informed on all these. As the strains proceeded, many of the listeners observed the chaired lady, whose back hair, by reason of her prominent position, so challenged inspection. Her face was not easily discernible, but the aforesaid cunning tress-weavings, the white ear and poll, and the curve of a cheek which was neither flaccid nor sallow, were signals that led to the expectation of good beauty in front. Such expectations are not infrequently disappointed as soon as the disclosure comes, and in the present case, when the lady, by a turn of the head, at length revealed herself, she was not so handsome as the people behind her had supposed, and even hoped. They did not know why. For one thing, alas the commonness of this complaint, she was less young than they had fancied her to be. Yet attractive her face unquestionably was, and not at all sickly. The revelation of its details came each time she turned to talk to a boy of 12 or 13 who stood beside her, and the shape of whose hat and jacket implied that he belonged to a well-known public school. The immediate bystanders could hear that he called her mother. When the end of the recital was reached and the audience withdrew, many chose to find their way out by passing at her elbow. Almost all turned their heads to take a full and near look at the interesting woman, who remained stationary in the chair till the way should be clear enough for her to be wheeled out without obstruction. As if she expected their glances and did not mind gratifying their curiosity, she met the eyes of several of her observers by lifting her own, showing these to be soft, brown, and affectionate orbs, a little plaintive in their regard. She was conducted out of the gardens and passed along the pavement till she disappeared from view, the schoolboy walking beside her. To inquiries made by some persons who watched her away, the answer came that she was the second wife of the incumbent of a neighboring parish, and that she was lame. She was generally believed to be a woman with a story, an innocent one, but a story of some sort or other. In conversing with her on their way home, the boy who walked at her elbow said that he hoped his father had not missed them. "He has been so comfortable these last few hours that I am sure he cannot have missed us," she replied. "Has, dear mother, not have," exclaimed the public school boy, with an impatient fastidiousness that was almost harsh. "Surely you know that by this time." His mother hastily adopted the correction, and did not resent his making it, or retaliate, as she might well have done, by bidding him to wipe that crumby mouth of his, whose condition had been caused by surreptitious attempts to eat a piece of cake without taking it out of the pocket wherein it lay concealed. After this, the pretty woman and the boy went onward in silence. That question of grammar bore upon her history, and she fell into reverie, of a somewhat sad kind to all appearance. It might have been assumed that she was wondering if she had done wisely in shaping her life as she had shaped it, to bring out such a result as this. In a remote nook in North Wessex, 40 miles from London, near the thriving county town of Aldbrickham, there stood a pretty village with its church and parsonage, which she knew well enough. But her son had never seen. It was her native village, Gaymead, and the first event bearing upon her present situation had occurred at that place when she was only a girl of 19. How well she remembered it, that first act in her little tragicomedy, the death of her reverend husband's first wife. It happened on a spring evening, and she, who now and for many years had filled that first wife's place, was then parlour-maid in the parson's house. When everything had been done that could be done, and the death was announced, she had gone out in the dusk to visit her parents, who were living in the same village, to tell them the sad news. As she opened the white swing gate and looked towards the trees which rose westward, shutting out the pale light of the evening sky, she discerned, without much surprise, the figure of a man standing in the hedge, though she roguishly exclaimed as a matter of form, "Oh, Sam, how you frightened me!" He was a young gardener of her acquaintance. She told him the particulars of the late event, and they stood silent, these two young people, in that elevated, calmly philosophic mind which is engendered when a tragedy has happened close at hand, and has not happened to the philosophers themselves, but it had its bearing upon their relations. "And will you stay on now at the vicarage, just the same?" asked he. She had hardly thought of that. "Oh, yes, I suppose," she said. "Everything will be just as usual, I imagine." He walked beside her towards her mother's. Presently his arm stole round her waist. She gently removed it, but he placed it there again, and she yielded the point. "You see, dear Sophy, you don't know that you'll stay on. You may want a home, and I shall be ready to offer one some day, though I may not be ready just yet." "Why, Sam, how can you be so fast? I've never even said I liked thee, and it is all your own doing, coming after me." "Still, it is nonsense to say I am not to have a try at you like the rest." He stooped to kiss her a farewell, for they had reached her mother's door. "No, Sam, you shan't," she cried, putting her hand over his mouth. "You ought to be more serious on such a night as this." And she bade him adieu without allowing him to kiss her or to come indoors. The vicar, just left a widower, was at this time a man about 40 years of age, of good family and childless. He had led a secluded existence in this college living, partly because there were no resident landowners, and his loss now intensified his habit of withdrawal from outward observation. He was still less seen than heretofore, kept himself still less in time with the rhythm and racket of the movements called progress in the world without. For many months after his wife's decease, the economy of his household remained as before. The cook, the housemaid, the parlour-maid, and the man out of doors performed their duties or left them undone, just as nature prompted them. The vicar knew not which. It was then represented to him that his servants seemed to have nothing to do in his small family of one. He was struck with the truth of this representation and decided to cut down his establishment. But he was forestalled by Sophy, the parlour-maid, who said one evening that she wished to leave him. "And why?" said the parson. "Sam Hobson has asked me to marry him, sir." "Well, do you want to marry?" "Not much. But it would be a home for me. And we have heard that one of us will have to leave." A day or two after she said, "I don't want to leave just yet, sir, if you don't wish it. Sam and I have quarrelled." He looked up at her. He had hardly ever observed her before, though he had been frequently conscious of her soft presence in the room. What a kitten-like, flexuous, tender creature she was. She was the only one of the servants with whom he came into immediate and continuous relation. What should he do if Sophy were gone? Sophy did not go, but one of the others did, and things went on quietly again. When Mr. Twycott the vicar was ill, Sophy brought up his meals to him, and she had no sooner left the room one day than he heard a noise on the stairs. She had slipped down with the tray and so twisted her foot that she could not stand. The village surgeon was called in. The vicar got better, but Sophy was incapacitated for a long time, and she was informed that she must never again walk much or engage in any occupation which required her to stand long on her feet. As soon as she was comparatively well, she spoke to him alone. Since she was forbidden to walk and bustle about, and indeed could not do so, it became her duty to leave. She could very well work at something sitting down, and she had an aunt, a seamstress. The parson had been very greatly moved by what she had suffered on his account, and he exclaimed, "No, Sophy, lame or not lame, I cannot let you go. You must never leave me again." He came close to her, and though she could never exactly tell how it happened, she became conscious of his lips upon her cheek. He then asked her to marry him. Sophy did not exactly love him, but she had a respect for him which almost amounted to veneration. Even if she had wished to get away from him, she hardly dared refuse a personage so reverend and august in her eyes, and she assented forthwith to be his wife. Thus it happened that one fine morning, when the doors of the church were naturally open for ventilation, and the singing birds fluttered in and alighted on the tie-beams of the roof, there was a marriage service at the communion rails which hardly a soul knew of. The parson and a neighbouring curate had entered at one door, and Sophy at another, followed by two necessary persons, whereupon, in a short time, there emerged a newly made husband and wife. Mr. Twycott knew perfectly well that he had committed social suicide by this step, despite Sophy's spotless character, and he had taken his measures accordingly. An exchange of livings had been arranged with an acquaintance who was incumbent of a church in the south of London, and as soon as possible the couple removed thither, abandoning their pretty country home, with trees and shrubs and glebe, for a narrow, dusty house in a long, straight street, and their fine peal of bells for the wretchedest one-tongued clangor that ever tortured mortal ears. It was all on her account. They were, however, away from everyone who had known her former position, and also under less observation from without than they would have had to put up with in any country parish. Sophy, the woman, was as charming a partner as a man could possess, though Sophy, the lady, had her deficiencies. She showed a natural aptitude for little domestic refinements, so far as related to things and manners, but in what is called culture, she was less intuitive. She had now been married more than 14 years, and her husband had taken much trouble with her education, but she still held confused ideas on the use of was and were, which did not beget a respect for her among the few acquaintances she made. Her great grief in this relation was that her only child, on whose education no expense had been and would be spared, was now old enough to perceive these deficiencies in his mother, and not only to see them, but to feel irritated at their existence. Thus she lived on in the city, and wasted hours in braiding her beautiful hair, till her once apple cheeks waned to pink of the very faintest. Her foot had never regained its natural strength after the accident, and she was mostly obliged to avoid walking altogether. Her husband had grown to like London for its freedom and its domestic privacy, but he was 20 years his Sophy's senior, and had latterly been seized with a serious illness. On this day, however, he had seemed to be well enough to justify her accompanying her son Randolph to the concert. Chapter 2. The next time we get a glimpse of her is when she appears in the mournful attire of a widow. Mr. Twycott had never rallied, and now lay in a well-packed cemetery to the south of the great city, where, if all the dead it contained had stood erect and alive, not one would have known him or recognized his name. The boy had dutifully followed him to the grave, and was now again at school. Throughout these changes, Sophie had been treated like the child she was in nature, though not in years. She was left with no control over anything that had been her husband's beyond her modest personal income. In his anxiety lest her inexperience should be overreached, he had safeguarded with trustees all he possibly could. The completion of the boy's course at the public school, to be followed in due time by Oxford and ordination, had been all provisioned and arranged, and she really had nothing to occupy her in the world but to eat and drink, and make a business of indolence, and go on weaving and coiling the nut-brown hair, merely keeping a home open for the son whenever he came to her during vacations. Foreseeing his probable decease long years before her husband in his lifetime had purchased for her use a semi-detached villa in the same long, straight road whereon the church and parsonage faced, which was to be hers as long as she chose to live in it. Here she now resided, looking out upon the fragment of lawn in front and through the railings at the ever-flowing traffic, or, bending forward over the window-sill on the first floor, stretching her eyes far up and down the vista of sooty trees, hazy air, and drab house facades, along which echoed the noises common to a suburban main thoroughfare. Somehow, her boy, with his aristocratic school knowledge, his grammars, and his aversions, was losing those wide infantine sympathies, extending as far as to the sun and moon themselves, with which he, like other children, had been born, and which his mother, a child of nature herself, had loved in him. He was reducing their compass to a population of a few thousand wealthy and titled people, the mere veneer of 1,000 million or so of others who did not interest him at all. He drifted further and further away from her, Sophie's milieu being a suburb of minor tradesmen and underclerks, and her almost only companions the two servants of her own house. It was not surprising that after her husband's death she soon lost the little artificial tastes she had acquired from him and became, in her son's eyes, a mother whose mistakes and origin it was his painful lot as a gentleman to blush for. As yet he was far from being man enough, if he ever would be, to rate these sins of hers at their true infinitesimal value beside the yearning fondness that welled up and remained penned in her heart till it should be more fully accepted by him, or by some other person or thing. If he had lived at home with her, he would have had all of it. But he seemed to require so very little in present circumstances, and it remained stored. Her life became insupportably dreary. She could not take walks, and had no interest in going for drives, or indeed in travelling anywhere. Nearly 2 years passed without an event, and still she looked on that suburban road, thinking of the village in which she had been born, and whither she would have gone back, oh, how gladly, even to work in the fields. Taking no exercise, she often could not sleep, and would rise in the night or early morning and look out upon the then vacant thoroughfare where the lamps stood like sentinels, waiting for some procession to go by. An approximation to such a procession was indeed made early every morning about 1 o'clock, when the country vehicles passed up with loads of vegetables for Covent Garden Market. She often saw them creeping along at this silent and dusky hour, wagon after wagon, bearing green bastions of cabbages, nodding to their fall, yet never falling, walls of baskets enclosing masses of beans and peas, pyramids of snow-white turnips, swaying howdahs of mixed produce, creeping along behind aged night-horses, who seemed ever patiently wondering between their hollow coughs why they had always to work at that still hour when all other sentient creatures were privileged to rest. Wrapped in a cloak, it was soothing to watch and sympathize with them when depression and nervousness hindered sleep, and to see how the fresh green stuff brightened to life as it came opposite the lamp, and how the sweating animals steamed and shone with their miles of travel. They had an interest, almost a charm. For Sophy, these semi-rural people and vehicles moving in an urban atmosphere, leading a life quite distinct from that of the daytime toilers on the same road. One morning, a man who accompanied a wagon load of potatoes gazed rather hard at the house fronts as he passed, and with a curious emotion, she thought his form was familiar to her. She looked out for him again. His being an old-fashioned conveyance with a yellow front, it was easily recognizable, and on the third night, after she saw it a second time. The man alongside was, as she had fancied, Sam Hobson, formerly gardener at Gay Mead, who would at one time have married her. She had occasionally thought of him and wondered if life in a cottage with him would not have been a happier lot than the life she had accepted. She had not thought of him passionately, but her now dismal situation lent an interest to his resurrection, a tender interest which it is impossible to exaggerate. She went back to bed and began thinking. When did these market gardeners, who travelled up to town so regularly at 1 or 2 in the morning, come back? She dimly recollected seeing their empty wagons, hardly noticeable amid the ordinary day traffic, passing down at some hour before noon. It was only April, but that morning, after breakfast, she had the window opened and sat looking out, the feeble sun shining full upon her. She affected to sew, but her eyes never left the street. Between 10 and 11, the desired wagon, now unladen, reappeared on its return journey. But Sam was not looking round him then, and drove on in a reverie. "Sam!" cried she. Turning with a start, his face lighted up. He called to him a little boy to hold the horse, alighted, and came and stood under her window. "I can't come down easily, Sam, or I would," she said. "Did you know I lived here?" "Well, Mrs. Twycott, I knew you lived along here somewhere. I have often looked out for 'ee." He briefly explained his own presence on the scene. He had long since given up his gardening in the village near Old Brickham and was now manager at a market gardener's on the south side of London, it being part of his duty to go up to Covent Garden with wagon loads of produce 2 or 3 times a week. In answer to her curious inquiry, he admitted that he had come to this particular district because he had seen in the Old Brickham paper a year or 2 before the announcement of the death in South London of the aforetime vicar of Gay Mead, which had revived an interest in her dwelling place that he could not extinguish, leading him to hover about the locality till his present post had been secured. They spoke of their native village in dear old North Wessex, the spots in which they had played together as children. She tried to feel that she was a dignified personage now, that she must not be too confidential with Sam. But she could not keep it up, and the tears hanging in her eyes were indicated in her voice. "You are not happy, Mrs. Twycott, I'm afraid," he said. "Oh, of course not. I lost my husband only the year before last." "Ah, I meant in another way. You'd like to be home again?" "This is my home, for life. The house belongs to me. But I understand." She let it out then. "Yes, Sam, I long for home. Our home. I should like to be there, and never leave it, and die there." But she remembered herself. "That's only a momentary feeling. I have a son, you know, a dear boy. He's at school now." "Somewhere handy, I suppose? I see there's lots on 'em along this road." "Oh, no, not in one of these wretched holes. At a public school, one of the most distinguished in England." "Chock it all, of course. I forget, ma'am, that you've been a lady for so many years." "No, I am not a lady," she said sadly. "I never shall be. But he's a gentleman, and that makes it, oh, how difficult for me." Chapter 3. The acquaintance, thus oddly reopened, proceeded apace. She often looked out to get a few words with him, by night or by day. Her sorrow was that she could not accompany her one old friend on foot a little way and talk more freely than she could do while he paused before the house. One night, at the beginning of June, when she was again on the watch after an absence of some days from the window, he entered the gate and said softly, "Now, wouldn't some air do you good? I've only half a load this morning. Why not ride up to Covent Garden with me? There's a nice seat on the cabbages where I've spread a sack. You can be home again in a cab before anybody is up." She refused at first and then, trembling with excitement, hastily finished her dressing and wrapped herself up in cloak and veil, afterwards sidling downstairs by the aid of the handrail in a way she could adopt on an emergency. When she had opened the door, she found Sam on the step, and he lifted her bodily on his strong arm across the little forecourt into his vehicle. Not a soul was visible or audible in the infinite length of the straight, flat highway, with its ever-waiting lamps converging to points in each direction. The air was fresh as country air at this hour, and the stars shone, except to the northeastward, where there was a whitish light, the dawn. Sam carefully placed her in the seat and drove on. They talked as they had talked in old days, Sam pulling himself up now and then when he thought himself too familiar. More than once she said with misgiving that she wondered if she ought to have indulged in the freak. "But I am so lonely in my house," she added, "and this makes me so happy." "You must come again, dear Mrs. Twycott. There is no time of day for taking the air like this." It grew lighter and lighter. The sparrows became busy in the streets, and the city waxed denser around them. When they approached the river, it was day, and on the bridge they beheld the full blaze of morning sunlight in the direction of St. Paul's, the river glistening towards it, and not a craft stirring. Near Covent Garden, he put her into a cab, and they parted, looking into each other's faces like the very old friends they were. She reached home without adventure, limped to the door, and let herself in with her latchkey unseen. The air and Sam's presence had revived her. Her cheeks were quite pink, almost beautiful. She had something to live for in addition to her son. A woman of pure instincts, she knew there had been nothing really wrong in the journey, but supposed it conventionally to be very wrong indeed. Soon, however, she gave way to the temptation of going with him again, and on this occasion their conversation was distinctly tender, and Sam said he never should forget her, notwithstanding that she had served him rather badly at one time. After much hesitation, he told her of a plan it was in his power to carry out, and one he should like to take in hand, since he did not care for London work. It was to set up as a master greengrocer down at Aldbrickham, the county town of their native place. He knew of an opening, a shop kept by aged people who wished to retire. "And why don't you do it then, Sam?" she asked with a slight heart-sinking. "Because I'm not sure if you'd join me. I know you wouldn't. Couldn't. Such a lady as you've been so long, you couldn't be a wife to a man like me." "I hardly suppose I could," she assented, also frightened at the idea. "If you could," he said eagerly, "you'd only have to sit in the back parlor and look through the glass partition when I was away sometimes, just to keep an eye on things. The lameness wouldn't hinder that. I'd keep you as genteel as ever I could, dear Sophy, if I might think of it," he pleaded. "Sam, I'll be frank," she said, putting her hand on his. "If it were only myself I would do it, and gladly, though everything I possess would be lost to me by marrying again. I don't mind that. It's more independent." "That's good of you, dear Sam, but there's something else. I have a son. I almost fancy when I am miserable sometimes that he is not really mine, but one I hold in trust for my late husband. He seems to belong so little to me personally, so entirely to his dead father. He is so much educated, and I so little that I do not feel dignified enough to be his mother. Well, he would have to be told." "Yes, unquestionably." Sam saw her thought and her fear. "Still, you can do as you like, Sophy, Mrs. Twycott," he added. "It is not you who are the child, but he." "Ah, you don't know. Sam, if I could, I would marry you some day. But you must wait a while, and let me think." It was enough for him, and he was blithe at their parting. Not so she. To tell Randolph seemed impossible. She could wait till he had gone up to Oxford, when what she did would affect his life but little. But would he ever tolerate the idea? And if not, could she defy him? She had not told him a word when the yearly cricket match came on at Lord's between the public schools, though Sam had already gone back to Aldbrickham. Mrs. Twycott felt stronger than usual. She went to the match with Randolph and was able to leave her chair and walk about occasionally. The bright idea occurred to her that she could casually broach the subject while moving round among the spectators when the boy's spirits were high with interest in the game, and he would weigh domestic matters as feathers in the scale beside the day's victory. They promenaded under the lurid July sun, this pair so wide apart yet so near, and Sophy saw the large proportion of boys like her own, in their broad white collars and dwarf hats, and all around the rows of great coaches under which was jumbled the debris of luxurious luncheons. Bones, pie crusts, champagne bottles, glasses, plates, napkins, and the family silver. While on the coaches sat the proud fathers and mothers, but never a poor mother like her. If Randolph had not appertained to these, had not centred all his interests in them, had not cared exclusively for the class they belonged to, how happy would things have been? A great huzzah at some small performance with the bat burst from the multitude of relatives, and Randolph jumped wildly into the air to see what had happened. Sophy fetched up the sentence that had been already shaped, but she could not get it out. The occasion was, perhaps, an inopportune one. The contrast between her story and the display of fashion, to which Randolph had grown to regard himself as akin, would be fatal. She awaited a better time. It was on an evening when they were alone in their plain suburban residence, where life was not blue but brown, that she ultimately broke silence, qualifying her announcement of a probable second marriage by assuring him that it would not take place for a long time to come, when he would be living quite independently of her. The boy thought the idea a very reasonable one, and asked if she had chosen anybody. She hesitated, and he seemed to have a misgiving. He hoped his stepfather would be a gentleman, he said. "Not what you call a gentleman," she answered timidly. "He'll be much as I was before I knew your father." And by degrees she acquainted him with the whole. The youth's face remained fixed for a moment. Then he flushed, leant on the table, and burst into passionate tears. His mother went up to him, kissed all of his face that she could get at, and patted his back as if he were still the baby he once had been, crying herself the while. When he had somewhat recovered from his paroxysm, he went hastily to his own room and fastened the door. Parleyings were attempted through the keyhole, outside which she waited and listened. It was long before he would reply, and when he did, it was to say sternly at her from within, "I am ashamed of you. It will ruin me. A miserable bore, a churl, a clown. It will degrade me in the eyes of all the gentlemen of England. Say no more. Perhaps I am wrong. I will struggle against it," she cried miserably. Before Randolph left her that summer, a letter arrived from Sam to inform her that he had been unexpectedly fortunate in obtaining the shop. He was in possession. It was the largest in the town, combining fruit with vegetables, and he thought it would form a home worthy even of her some day. Might he not run up to town to see her? She met him by stealth and said he must still wait for her final answer. The autumn dragged on, and when Randolph was home at Christmas for the holidays, she broached the matter again. But the young gentleman was inexorable. It was dropped for months, renewed again, abandoned under his repugnance, again attempted, and thus the gentle creature reasoned and pleaded till 4 or 5 long years had passed. Then the faithful Sam revived his suit with some peremptoriness. Sophy's son, now an undergraduate, was down from Oxford one Easter, when she again opened the subject. As soon as he was ordained, she argued, he would have a home of his own, wherein she, with her bad grammar and her ignorance, would be an encumbrance to him. Better obliterate her as much as possible. He showed a more manly anger now, but would not agree. She, on her side, was more persistent, and he had doubts whether she could be trusted in his absence. But by indignation and contempt for her taste, he completely maintained his ascendancy, and finally taking her before a little cross and altar that he had erected in his bedroom for his private devotions, there bade her kneel and swear that she would not wed Samuel Hobson without his consent. "I owe this to my father," he said. The poor woman swore, thinking he would soften as soon as he was ordained and in full swing of clerical work. But he did not. His education had by this time sufficiently ousted his humanity to keep him quite firm. Though his mother might have led an idyllic life with her faithful fruiterer and greengrocer, and nobody have been anything the worse in the world. Her lameness became more confirmed as time went on, and she seldom or never left the house in the long southern thoroughfare, where she seemed to be pining her heart away. "Why mayn't I say to Sam that I'll marry him? Why mayn't I?" she would murmur plaintively to herself when nobody was near. Some 4 years after this date, a middle-aged man was standing at the door of the largest fruiterer's shop in Aldbrickham. He was the proprietor, but today, instead of his usual business attire, he wore a neat suit of black, and his window was partly shuttered. From the railway station, a funeral procession was seen approaching. It passed his door and went out of the town towards the village of Gaymead. The man, whose eyes were wet, held his hat in his hand as the vehicles moved by, while from the mourning coach a young, smooth-shaven priest in a high waistcoat looked black as a cloud at the shopkeeper standing there.